So, with this built-in trajectory toward a new canon that would give authorized record of the life and teachings of Jesus and the foundational teachings of his authoritative spokesman, what remained for the early church to do was to discern which writings were the fulfillment of Jesus' promise to the apostles. The rise of heretical teachings and the use of distorted books, Marcion, for example, around 140, spurred the process of canonization. How did the church do that? Before I say any more, something just came to my mind, which when I heard it years and years ago from Dr. Goppelt, my professor in Germany, it was very, very significant. I'll just throw it out to you. See, you can store it away and use it when it comes in handy. What you're going to see in a moment is that the closing and the final recognition of the New Testament canon, the 27 books that we have as a rule and authority and inspired and authoritative and inspired, was recognized in the First Council in the 4th century. 3 something, I'll see it in a minute. So, what's happening in the first 3 centuries with the authoritative books? And the answer is that they are exercising their authority as they prove themselves to be apostolic, and the church is being governed by them, and the church is gradually recognizing which are and which aren't, and there are competing books. And Dr. Goppelt observed that the theology, in many respects, of the early church becomes purer after the formal recognition of the canon than it was before, for this very reason, namely that the books and the authoritative canon was fully recognized and finished, so that everybody was keying off the same group of documents instead of random choices. The reason that's significant is because there are a lot of people today that are urging us to go back to the pristine first 2 or 3 centuries with the assumption the closer you are to Jesus in the books you read, the more accurate will be the theology. And Professor Goppel's saying, no way. That does not follow. It may be true in any given case. It just doesn't follow because the books were working their way into the life of the church gradually, and the church then finally said, these are they. These are the ones that have proved themselves over the last 3 centuries. But in that process, you got people all over the world saying off-the-wall things because they don't have the fullness of the canon with which to test their ideas. That's significant for you to think about. So when you hear somebody say, I think we should go back to the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries and read all that and follow that as our key for what's orthodox, I say, well, maybe not. There may be insights there that you don't get anywhere else, but be careful you don't assume that that's the case. It makes a lot of sense to me that once that canon is clearly unified and the one book that the whole church is now saying yes to, would be a better foundation for a coherent big church theology than the first 3 centuries. Here are the books. The reason for these books, I skipped it. The main criterion for the books that were recognized as authoritative and canonical was apostolicity. Not just was it a book written by an apostle, but also was it written in the company of an apostle, or presumably with his endorsement and approval. For example, here they are. Matthew. These are just the authors now. Matthew, apostle. Mark, Peter's interpreter and assistant. They have witness to that in Papias' writings. Luke, close associate and partner of Paul, who wrote more of the New Testament than anybody. That's why I named my first son Karsten Luke. Karsten because he was born in Germany, and Luke because Luke wrote more of the New Testament than anybody else. And I thought maybe he'll be a writer someday, which he is. You thought Paul wrote most of the New Testament, but Luke, Acts together are more of the New Testament than all of Paul. So Luke is the dominant quantitative writer in the New Testament. And he, as you can see from the book of Acts, is traveling with Paul. I'll just give you a little tidbit of what is speculation, but I think warranted. Luke says Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. How does he know that? And inspiration, in my understanding, folds in all the means by which an author finds out true things. God doesn't have to dictate that Mary, I think Mary told him that. I think he interviewed Mary because he's roaming around in Palestine for 2 years while Paul's in jail in the book of Acts at the end of his life. We know that because of the we sections in the book of Acts. We went here and we went there. And so the we sections, you got Luke arriving there with Paul, only Paul gets slammed in jail for 2 years. What's Luke doing all that time? Luke's not from Judea. He's a Gentile. He's going everywhere, talking to people who knew Jesus. I mean, what else would you do? Like if you had 2 years to spare? Right in his home territory, and you hadn't grown up there? But the reason we say it's apostolic, even though he wasn't an apostle, is that he was right there with the apostle Paul. John was an apostle, 13 epistles of Paul, he was an apostle. Hebrews, we don't know who wrote Hebrews, but at the end it says, I urge you, brethren, bear with this word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly. Take notice that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom, if he comes soon, I shall see you. Greet all the leaders. I only point that out to say, I don't know who the writer of the Hebrews was, but he was in the band around Paul and Timothy here. Looks like. James, brother of Jesus, called an apostle probably in Galatians 1:19. But I did not see any other of the apostles except James. Maybe it's not interpreted that way. Could be except James, doesn't have to mean he was an apostle, but it may mean that he was viewed as a kind of apostle, at any rate, very closely connected to the apostles, and then Peter, and then John, Jude, the brother of James, and Revelation, John. Those are the books that we have in the New Testament, or the authors that we have, and the argument is that they are apostolic, even though they are not all apostles. The most controversial books that took the longest to confirm themselves for the whole church were Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. There was no controversy about the others. But these, controversy swarmed around them. But in the end, the church discerned their harmony with the others and their antiquity and essential apostolicity. The core list, apart from the controverted books, was known at the latest in the latter part of the 2nd century. Irenaeus mentions them, the list of 27 in 180, though not in any official way. That came 367. The first list known to us with all 27 books is in the festal letter of Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, in AD 367. So I misspoke when I said that all of them were listed in Irenaeus. I forget just how many. Most of them were there. And here, the list was affirmed by the Synod of Hippo, then again in 393. Now the question, when you look how late that date is did the church finally create this canon or what? Dr. Folks Jackson expresses my view when he says, the church assuredly did not make the New Testament. The two grew up together. I'm going to distance myself therefore, from the Roman Catholic understanding of authority here, the authority of the church, and go with F.F. Bruce. And F.F. Bruce puts it like this: what is particularly important to notice is that the New Testament canon was not demarcated by the arbitrary decree of any church council. When at last a church council, the Synod of Hippo in AD 393, listed the 27 books of the New Testament, it did not confer upon them any authority which they did not already possess, but simply recorded their previously established canonicity. Let me just try to say this gently. One of the things that separates Protestants and Roman Catholics is the way you think about authority of the Bible in relationship to the church. Protestants like to say that the Bible created the church, and Catholics tend to say the church created or confirmed the Bible. In other words, the Bible has its authority because the church councils gave it their authority, and thus align church authority, Pope especially, the office that he holds, and Bible are together in the Roman Catholic Church, and Protestants order it like this: Bible and church. And that's where I am, and I think that's what happened, that the Bible pressed itself upon the church, and the church didn't create a canon, it recognized a canon. So what is the canon? 5 books of narrative: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Letters, 21 of them. And then a book of visions, the Revelation. And that's what makes up our Bible. So that's how the Bible came to be, and why I believe what we have as the Bible is what we should have as the Bible. No books are missing that should be in it, and no books are in it that shouldn't be there. I have a list here of books on the canon, which I don't expect you to write down now, but if you want to look at them later, you can. Metzger, Bruce, Harris, Warfield, Geisler. There are many books, and you can, it's amazing what you can do on the internet these days. You just need to be discerning what you find and do with it, but amazing information is there. Step 3. Do we have the very words written by the biblical authors? Because if you say these are the right books, but in fact they've been so distorted by transmission that you can't trust them, then it doesn't really matter that you have the right books, because you've lost what was in them anyway, which is what some people are saying today. Do we have any of the original manuscripts? I'm trying to move through this quickly. This is pretty technical stuff, and it would be easy, and in a sense it would be fun to sink down into it, but I don't think the payoff is as big here as some other things that we could talk about. So let me try to move quickly. Do we have any of the original manuscripts? No, we don't. We do not have any of the actual piece of paper or papyrus or parchment that a biblical writer actually wrote on. How were the manuscripts of the New Testament preserved? The first printed Greek New Testament was in 1516 by Erasmus. Before that, everything was transmitted by copying, by hand. And we owe our Bible to the meticulous love and care given by countless monks and scholars for the first 1,500 years of the church era. How many manuscripts are there? When I prepared this several years ago, well, actually I quoted from 1967 statistics, because that's the book I studied textual criticism in. But I just saw online today at Justin Taylor's blog, reading an article by Dan Wallace, that he said today 5,700 manuscript fragments of the New Testament in the original Greek. 1967, the statistics were these minuscule texts, lectionary portions, papyri, but you don't need to know that. How does this amount of evidence compare with other ancient writings of the same era? We have no original manuscripts of any other writers from this period of history. It's phenomenal that the New Testament so outshines all others just in terms of quantity. I could give you examples here. Caesar's Gallic Wars, 10 manuscripts available. Parts of Roman history, Livy, 20 manuscripts. The Histories and Annals of Tacitus, 2 manuscripts. History of Thucydides, 8 manuscripts, compared to 5,000 fragments of manuscripts for the New Testament. It's simply astonishing. It creates problems, but it creates amazing potential as well. Does this small number of manuscripts cause secular scholars to despair that we can know what these writers wrote, the ones I just listed? F.F. Bruce says no classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides is in doubt because the earliest manuscripts of their works, which are of any use to us, are over 1,300 years later than the originals, whereas New Testament go back to the 2nd century, some of them. So are you saying that the New Testament is unique in having so many manuscripts? Yes. No other ancient book comes close to this kind of wealth of diverse preservation. What are some of these oldest manuscripts? The oldest is a papyrus, comes from about AD 130. Just confirmed that again today. Some date it is into the 1st century and some later, like this, and contains John 18:31 to 33 and 37 following. Just a little fragment, and you see it on both sides. The only full early manuscript of the New Testament comes from AD 350, called the Codex Sinaiticus, because it was discovered in the monastery on Mount Sinai. So are the manuscripts the only source of our knowledge of the original wording of the New Testament writings? No. In addition to manuscripts, there are quotations from the New Testament in very early writers outside the New Testament. For example, in the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas and Clement's letter to the Corinthians were produced around AD 100 and quote extensively from the New Testament, so you can compare what they quoted and what's actually there in the Greek manuscripts. The letters of Polycarp and Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, around AD 120, contain many quotes from the Gospels and the letters of Paul. Do all these manuscripts create problems or solutions for getting back to the original writings? The huge number of manuscripts of the New Testament results in two things. One, there are many variations in wording among them because they were all copied by hand and subject to human error. There are so many manuscripts that these errors tend to be self-correcting by the many manuscript witnesses we have to compare. Here's what F.F. Bruce says. Fortunately, if the great number of manuscripts increases the number of scribal errors, it increases proportionally the means of correcting such errors so that the margin of doubt left in the process of recovering the exact original wording is not so large as might be feared. It is, in truth, remarkably small. Is there a branch of biblical studies that focuses on this problem of getting back to the wording of the original writings? Yes, the branch of biblical studies that works with all these sources to determine the best manuscript is textual criticism, and I thank God that there are text critics who do that work for us. When I was in Germany, just to give you a flavor for this, when I was in Germany, 1971 to 1974, doing my dissertation on Love Your Enemies, Jesus' love command in the early Christian ethical teaching and in the synoptics, I was so nervous. I was just, could I do this? I felt like I'd gotten into this program under false pretenses because they didn't look at any of my papers or any of my grades. They just said, come, because Dr. Ladd recommended me. And I thought, this is crazy. They should test me and see if I can do this. And so here I am. I don't speak German well enough. I've been there about 9 months, been studying like crazy. And Dr. Goppelt assigns me a topic, and I say, looks great, I'll do it. And he says, you'll present to the seminar on, and gave me the date, about 2 months out. So that means a group of 6 people, all speaking German, sitting in his living room with glasses of wine sitting in front of them. It's because we're in Germany, right? And he said, you can write in English, not a problem. You can present in English, but the discussion will be in German. So what do? What would you do on your first paper that you're going to present as part of your dissertation on a paragraph of Jesus' teaching on love your enemies? Matthew 5:43 to 48. I spent the whole time on text criticism. I'm going to be scholarly, right? I'm going to prove these are the very words that Matthew wrote. I got to have a text that I can count on. So I worked my pants off to show with all the manuscript evidence that this is. So I got there and I presented my paper. I read it. It was really complicated. And none of them were native English speakers, and so I'm sure it taxed them to the limit. And when I was done, Professor Goppelt, he's over there, and he said, Herr Pieper, that's what he called me, Herr Pieper. Herr Pieper, wir brauchen das nicht machen. We don't need to do this. The text critics have done this. We don't need to do this anymore. That work is finished. Okay, great. I just take what's in the Nestle Aland text and go with it. It was a lesson for me how the entire radical, critical German scene believes that the text critical work has been done, and it's been done well. In other words, the documents that we have in front of us in our Greek New Testament are considered to be valid by the most liberal German scholars. Now, let me show you what I mean when I say that, just so you don't over-interpret it. Let's see. It's out of order here, I think. Here we go. F.J.A. Hort, the proportion of words virtually accepted on all hands as raised above doubt is great. Let me get the picture for you here, because I might have lost some of you. You got 5,700 fragments with a few whole manuscripts of Greek texts of the New Testament. Text critics compare John 18:30 in one to John 18:30 in another, and they see, oh, here we have a plural and here we have a singular. Or here we have a sigma at the end and here we don't have a sigma at the end. Or here we have one word. And so they're not the same. You say, okay, which is original? And if you just had two, you'd be hard put. You might say the oldest, or you might say the reading is the hardest, and so that's probably original. You got these criteria. But when you have 5,700, the evidences of what's original starts to mount up with greater, the variations increase, but so do the evidences for why you can assume one and not the other. And this is talking about how many of these variations are up for grabs. The proportion of words virtually accepted on all hands has been raised above doubt as is great, not less than a rough computation, 7/8 of the whole. The remaining 1/8, formed in great part by changes of order and other comparative trivialities, constitutes the whole area of textual criticism. The words, in our opinion, still subject to doubt, only make up about 1/60th of the whole New Testament. Substantial variation is but a small fraction of the whole residuary variation and can hardly form more than a 1,000th part of the entire text. F.F. Bruce puts it this way: the variant readings about which any doubt remains among textual critics of the New Testament affects no material question of historic fact or of Christian faith and practice. In other words, the remaining uncertainties of any significant uncertainty don't affect the substance of what the New Testament is teaching. Now, that's being challenged today by Bart Ehrman and others, but I think most scholars would still say that is in fact the case. Does it matter? I mean, why do we say, some people bring this up, and so let me just address it briefly. Does the doctrine of inerrancy in the original manuscripts matter? Our affirmation of faith says, we believe that the Bible is the Word of God, fully inspired and without error in the original manuscripts, which we don't have. So people scoff at that. They say, you don't even have it. What good is it to affirm the infallibility of it? I think it matters. And this is my effort to say why. Yes, it matters because it affirms the reality of objective historical inspiration. There is an objective measuring rod for us to return to the degree that we come close to the wording of the original, we come close to the very words of God. We are there for all practical purposes. So I think it does matter to say that the Bible is inspired and inerrant in the original manuscripts.